Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 8, The League of Nations. The story of the peace conference divides itself naturally into three well-marked phases, which the reader would do well to keep in mind as the narrative proceeds. First, the Wilson period, or the period of commissions and of the Council of Ten, culminating in the drafting of the Covenant of the League of Nations. This lasted for a month, from the first meeting of the Council of Ten on January 14 down to the first return of President Wilson to America on February 16. Secondly, the Balfour period, when President Wilson had returned to Washington and Mr. Lloyd George to London, and when Monsieur Clemenceau was prostrated by the bullet of an assassin. In this period, Mr. Balfour, in full accord with Mr. Lloyd George, included the commissions to abridge and terminate their ever-spreading labors by March 8 and concentrated all attention upon the actual work of making peace. Thirdly, the triumvirate period, when the main issues were fought out by Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson in the Council of Four, and finally alone together. This triumvirate, after tense daily discussions lasting for more than 2 months, framed preliminaries of peace which were accepted by all the Allied states, great and small, and then presented to the enemy in the treaties of Versailles, Saint-Germain, Trianon, and Neuilly. To understand the conference, the reader must grasp both the procedure and how it arose. The logical French scheme of November 29 had not been accepted by President Wilson. Nevertheless, there was general, if tacit, agreement that in the first instance the victors should meet together alone. They would then draw up preliminary peace terms, and after thrashing these out among themselves, would present draft treaties unitedly to the enemy. The French had proposed, and the British, Italians, and Japanese expected that from among the victors, the leaders of the 5 great powers would confer privately beforehand and would settle all the largest questions and principles among themselves before the crowd of small states were admitted to the discussion. However, except for the questions of procedure mentioned in the last chapter, this all-important and, as it proved, indispensable stage never had its proper place. The main conference overlapped and overlaid the vital preparatory discussions. The first plenary session of January 18 saw the whole 27 states represented and no agreement on any fundamental matter among the 5 principal Allied powers. Of course, the 5 great powers, from the beginning to the end, settled everything as they choose, and nothing could have prevented them from doing so. But these primordial facts only became apparent and dominant after a prolonged period of uncertainty and confusion. Decisions were taken not as the result of systematized study and discussion, but only when some individual topic reached a condition of crisis. Throughout there was no considered order of priority, no thought-out plan of descending from the general to the particular. All sorts of thorny secondary questions were discussed and fought over by chiefs who had not agreed upon the primary foundations. There was no mutual confidence between the 5 great powers, and no achievement of a common point of view. 2 months of discussion took place while all the burning issues were hidden in the breasts of the leading plenipotentiaries. In fact, so far as I have been able to ascertain, right down to the end of March, there never was any heart-to-heart and frank conversation between the 3 men on whom ultimately everything rested, Mr. Lloyd George, Monsieur Clemenceau, and President Wilson. This is the dominating fact of the Wilson and Balfour stages. These chiefs were, however, continually in official contact. Not only were there frequent sessions called conversations of the Council of Ten, but the same men, or some of them, often sat together as the Supreme War Council. Footnote: the word war was gradually dropped. End of footnote. This instrument had reached a very high development during the concluding months of the war. The meetings of the Supreme War Council were not concerned with the terms of peace. Many practical and urgent matters pressed upon them from week to week. For instance, the whole economic situation, the continuance of the terms of the armistice, the relations with Russia. And then, from time to time, the disorders of Europe rose to explosion point. The newly founded Republic of Poland found itself in a state of war with the people of East Galicia, and the Supreme War Council had to interfere. They sent out a special commission to Poland, and we saw the spectacle of an international train starting on an adventurous journey with its 5 heavily guarded carriages, each for a separate nation. In spite of hazards, the International Commission reached Warsaw and patched up some kind of truce between the Poles and the Ukrainians. Then similar difficulties arose in Teschen. The Allies had to intervene to prevent the outbreak of fighting between the Poles and the Czechoslovaks. In April again, they had to intervene in consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution of Béla Kun in Hungary and the great dangers which it involved. The situation was indeed difficult and dangerous in the last degree. There was serious peril that the whole continent might lapse into anarchy. Everyone turned to the principal allies, looking for help, but in many cases the help could not be given. They wanted food, but there was still a shortage of food even in the Allied countries. They wanted military occupations, but the British, whose soldiers were in the greatest demand as pacifiers, could not spare many troops and could not risk sending small detachments to remote districts far from the sea. All these consequential war measures occupied during the first months much of the time and the energy of the principal powers. This dual association exercised an irresistible effect upon the making of the peace. The 5 great powers found themselves continually together for one cause or another. In the morning they conversed as a council of 10 about the peace settlements. In the afternoon they sat as a Supreme Council, taking important executive decisions. The rest of the 27 states, who, according to the fiction originally adopted, were of equal status, were from time to time assembled in plenary sessions, where, under conditions of the fullest publicity, nothing of any importance could ever be done. President Wilson yielded himself inevitably and almost insensibly to these developments. He saw that they did not arise from the evil nature of European diplomacy, but from practical and physical causes against which it was vain to strive. How could any thorny question affecting the main interests of nations, great or small, be helpfully debated by 27 powers in public? If platitudes and honeyed words alone were used, the proceedings would be a farce. If plain speaking were indulged in, they would become a bear garden. Even the Council of 10, solely composed of the leading statesmen of the greatest powers and meeting in secret, was too unwieldy. With its attendant experts, it rarely numbered less than 50 persons of very various rank and status. Even secrecy was doubtful, apart from calculated leakages. We shall see the President presently, guided by common sense and the force of facts, lock himself up with Clemenceau and Lloyd George, and with only Maurice Hankey to record and give precise shape to the decisions, settle every question of crucial importance. If such meetings had taken place in December or even in January, the whole course of the peace conference would have been smooth and coherent. He had begun by rejecting the obvious and the easy. He welcomed them warmly when they returned to him upside down after many days. The moment at length came for the President to launch his main policy. He declared that a League of Nations must become an integral part of the Treaty of Peace and must have priority over all territorial or economic settlements. It was upon the structure of the League that the whole treaty should be built, and with its general principles all must be in harmony. This would have been admirable if a preliminary understanding had been reached on the main issues between the leading men, and if they had known where they stood with one another in essentials and had not felt that very serious conflicts impended. But now it seemed that the conference was to dive into interminable academic discussions upon a new constitution for mankind, while all the practical and clement issues had to drum their heels outside the door. It was agreed that a special commission upon the constitution of the League of Nations should be appointed by a plenary session of the conference. The discussions of the Council of Ten, at which this procedure was settled, are instructive reading. President Wilson hitherto, the champion of the smaller powers, had already realized that no business would be done if any large number of them were allowed to sit upon the commission of the League. He therefore argued for the smallest possible body composed of representatives of the highest responsibility. Clemenceau and Lloyd George, on the other hand, somewhat ironically voiced the claims of the smaller nations. The League was to be their shield and buckler. Ought they not to be there? Would this not open to them a useful sphere of activity instead of leaving them to loaf morosely about Paris waiting for the decisions of the Council of Ten? All the great powers except the United States were profoundly disquieted at the total lack of progress, and their representatives had to face a rising menace of impatience at home. While the main questions were unsettled, every aspect of the League of Nations constitution would have to be vigilantly scrutinized. They regarded with despair the prospect of so many weeks or even months' delay. In the end, a very good commission was appointed, which included some of the smaller nations and yet was not unmanageable in numbers. The two foremost British champions of the policy, Lord Robert Cecil, footnote, now Viscount Cecil of Chelwood, end of footnote, and General Smuts were appointed delegates. Wilson himself decided to preside, and the immense task was vigorously taken in hand. The history of the Peace Conference, edited by Dr. Temperley and published under the auspices of the Institute of Foreign Affairs, attributes the origin of the League of Nations to three reasons. First, the need of some settled Council of Nations which would be responsible for the maintenance of peace. Secondly, the need for a more comprehensive guarantee of the safety of small nations, as proved by the fate of Belgium. And thirdly, a growing belief in the advantages of economic cooperation. An additional argument might be found in the fact that 20 million men had been blowing each other to pieces for more than 4 years, that this process had now stopped, and most people hoped it would not begin again. It is sometimes pretended that the League of Nations was an American inspiration forced and foisted upon Europe against its forward inclination. The facts are different. The idea had stirred in most civilized countries during the last 3 years of the war, and various societies had been formed to propagate it both in America and in England. Lord Robert Cecil was the first Englishman to put something down in writing, and he wrote a paper on this subject at the end of 1916. His thesis, though necessarily undeveloped, amounting indeed only to a rough draft of what now forms Articles 15 and 16 of the Covenant, provided a basis for a committee set up in 1917 under Lord Fillmore's presidency to work upon. This committee produced draft statutes of a league in a document circulated to the United States, among other governments, early in 1918. In the summer of 1918, President Wilson deputed Colonel House to work upon the Fillmore draft, and House's suggestions reached him on July 16. The main addition made by House was the positive guarantee of the territorial integrity and independence of the states members of the League. Fillmore's draft had been content merely to provide guarantees for the execution of arbitration agreements. When Wilson came to revise this, he omitted the clause providing for an international court, but added tremendous words, indeed such words as Lord Robert Cecil had advocated in his early draft, that violation should be punished by lethal force. Meanwhile, General Smuts produced independently on December 16, 1918, his own draft of a league which embodied detailed suggestions of an organization proposed to set up a council as well as the assembly, included a provision for the abolishment of conscription and for the limitation of military equipment, and recommended a mandatory system for backward territories or states in tutelage. Of Wilson's share in the task, his chronicler, Mr. Baker, says, "Practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenants of the League was original with the President. His relation to it was mainly that of editor or compilist, selecting or rejecting or compiling the projects which came in to him from other sources." Footnote. In Volume 1, page 242. End of footnote. This in no wise detracts from the magnitude of Wilson's contribution. He embodied all helpful amendments in his own draft, and also added one draft article designed to ensure fair hours and humane conditions for labor, and another requiring new states to grant equal rights to minorities. This was the draft which the Americans presented on January 10, 1919, at the Peace Conference, and 10 days later the British delegation also produced the most up-to-date version of the British ideas on the subject. The British and American drafts, which in all essentials meant the same thing, were consolidated by Sir Cecil Hurst, representing Great Britain, and Mr. Hunter Miller, the United States. They were considered and amended by the League Commission during the latter part of January and beginning of February, and eventually laid before a plenary session of the conference on February 14. Thus the League of Nations was an Anglo-Saxon conception arising from the moral earnestness of persons of similar temperament on both sides of the Atlantic. President Wilson had made this great idea his own, and when all the vexations of these days and his own mistakes are forgotten, it is in the establishment and ascendancy of a new international society that his memory will be enshrined. The British were throughout his chief supporters. In our island all liberal elements clung and cling to the plan. All other right-minded persons realized the advantages which such a league might confer upon the widely dispersed communities of the British Empire. Criticism arose only from skepticism. Was it not too good to be true? Could it be a substitute for national armaments? Might it not turn out in the hour of need to be an illusion, and those who had counted on it perish in some future earthquake? It seemed to these critics more prudent to retain the old proved safeguards while the new were a building. But the support given by Great Britain to President Wilson's League of Nations plan was wholehearted, positive, and above all, practical. Without it he could never have succeeded. It was natural that the smaller or weaker states of the world should acclaim a reign of law which would protect them from overlordship or aggression. France and Italy, and, on the other side of the globe, Japan, received the new gospel with good will. But being much closer anchored to the grim realities, they reproduced in more stubborn forms the misgivings of British skeptics. The real opposition came from the United States. The whole tradition of the American people had been separation from the tribulations and antagonisms of the old and older worlds. The Atlantic pleaded 3,000 and the Pacific 7,000 reasons against entanglements in these far-off affairs. All the teachings of the fathers of the American Union from Washington to Monroe had germinated non-intervention. Science has to march perhaps another 50 years before the gulfs of ocean space are rendered politically meaningless. This is no long period in human history, but it far exceeds the life of the Paris Conference in the year of grace 1919. Moreover, as has been seen, President Wilson had taken no measures to conciliate or disarm the inveterate and natural aversion of his own countrymen. It was a party, not as a national leader, that he sought to rule the United States and lecture Europe. His native foundations broke beneath him. While his arm was lifted in rebuke of the embarrassed and respectful governments of the Old World, he was unceremoniously hauled out of the pulpit by his hefty party opponents at home. Some of the most gifted Americans whom I have met, men of light and leading, as the saying goes, have said, "European politicians ought to have understood the Constitution of the United States. You ought to have known that the President, without the Senate, could do nothing. You have only yourselves to blame if you have suffered through counting on his personal decisions or undertakings." They had no validity. There were from the very beginning serious doubts about the credentials of President Wilson. The supreme efficacy of the League of Nations depended upon the accession of the United States. Here was the great new external balancing factor. Was it at the command of President Wilson? If it were not, no surge of liberal sentiment in the various countries could replace it. It would, on the other hand, have been highly imprudent to canvass his credentials. What would have happened if, for instance, Lloyd George and Clemenceau had said across the table, "We know we speak for the overwhelming mass of our two countries. Test it any way you will. But is it not true that nothing but your fixed and expiring tenure of office prevents you from being thrown out of power? Your constitutional authority is not complete. Where is the Senate of the United States? We are told that you have lost control both of the Senate and the Congress. Are you just a well-meaning philosopher, eager to reform others, or do you carry the faith and will of the American nation?" Probably the Americans would have been deeply offended. They would have replied, "You were glad enough to have our troops and money on President Wilson's authority. Now that you are out of your troubles, you flout the supreme magistrate of the Republic. Whatever party we belong to, we resent that. It is an insult to suggest that we shall not make good all our undertakings, and in the face of that insult we will quit the scene." So no one questioned the president's title. Moreover, in spite of 100 irritations and anxieties, there was an underlying and true conviction in English and French minds that he was the most forthcoming friend of Europe who, up to that moment, had crossed the Atlantic. The composition of the League of Nations Commission was determined by a meeting of the Council of Ten on January 22, by a plenary session of the Peace Conference on January 25. It began its labor on February 2. But meanwhile an acute tension had developed between Great Britain and the Dominions upon the question of the mandatory principle in regard to conquered territory. The principle owed its birth to General Smuts. Its application has now to be extended to limits the general had not contemplated. The theory that the conquered German colonies, or parts of Turkey, would be held by the victors not as their own property, but in trust for all mankind under the League of Nations, and with formal international supervision of the treatment of the natives, seemed to meet all requirements. It was welcomed by President Wilson on the highest grounds. but the general had only intended it to apply to ex-Russian, ex-Turkish or ex-Austro-Hungarian territory. He had never thought it suited to the regions conquered in the course of the war by the various British dominions. Least of all had he expected it to be applied to the case of German Southwest Africa, which the Union government had occupied and intended to annex. This was carrying a sound principle too far. The self-governing dominions all took the view that the mandatory principle should not apply to the places they had taken. The British government could not be indifferent to territorial gains. The nation looked for some compensation for its awful losses. In the result of long and costly campaigns, the British armies held Palestine, Mesopotamia, the Cameroons, and German East Africa. The mandatory system imposed no conditions which had not for many years been strictly observed throughout the British colonial empire. Alone among all the colonial possessions of the great powers, the immense tropical domains of the British Crown had been free to the trade of all nations. The ships of all countries used British colonial ports as freely as their own. There had never been any discrimination in favor of British nationals. As for our treatment of the natives, we had nothing to fear from fair international scrutiny. On the contrary, we were proud to explain and expose our system. Mr. Lloyd George therefore stood forward at once and declared the British acceptance of the mandatory principle unreservedly for all territory which the British fleets and armies had wrested from the Turks and the Germans. We could not, however, speak for the self-governing dominions. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were to us precious entities from which we could not separate ourselves, but which we could not control. Of course, the king was supreme. Cession or annexation of territory, like peace or war, resided in the crown. But what minister, except in the face of unutterable wrong, would invoke this abstract and almost mystic function against a beloved member of the family? Australia had captured New Guinea, New Zealand Samoa, and the Union German Southwest Africa. They did not mean to give them up, nor ought they to be pressed to do so. To speak of these places as communities shoved hither and thither as pawns in a diplomatic game is an abuse of language. These territories, sparsely populated by primitive races, had been part of the brand-new outfit of less desirable colonies which Great Britain had in the 19th century willingly seen accorded to the growth of the German power. Every one of them presented to each of these remote dominions an inroad upon their own Monroe Doctrine, and every one had been found to be a menace and the cause of bloodshed in the recent conflict. They had taken them, they would not give them up. But their title deeds did not depend on local conquests. They were consecrated by sacrifice in the common cause. These three dominions, aggregating together less than a twelfth of the white population of the United States, had lost nearly as many lives on the battlefields of Europe, 6, 11, or 12,000 miles from home, in a cause which the United States had made its own. Whatever happened, we could not quarrel with them. Accordingly, on January 23, Mr. Lloyd George introduced to the Council of Ten the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. There they stood, armed in the panoply of democracy, of war service, and of young nationhood. Borden, with white Canada, French and English, behind him. Massey of New Zealand, fearless and faultless in all that touched the common cause. Hughes, the vibrant Australian Labour Premier, the grand and rugged Botha, the gifted, philosophical, persuasive Smuts. There they stood, and with them stood not only the modern age but the future. These figures and what they represented were not to be lightly put aside. No George III England this, no smooth-phrased European diplomatists, no benighted old-world aristocrats. Here were the Pilgrim Fathers, with tongues as plain in speech and lands as vast to till. Wilson was not unmoved by their insignia. This, at any rate, was not what he had crossed the Atlantic to chastise. But he had his cause to defend, and it was a great one. A jagged debate ensued. Australia, New Zealand and South Africa said they meant to keep the colonies they had taken from the Germans, and Canada said she stood with them. "And do you mean, Mr. Hughes," said the President, "that in certain circumstances Australia would place herself in opposition to the opinion of the whole civilized world?" Mr. Hughes, who was very deaf, had an instrument like a machine-gun emplaced upon the table by which he heard all he wanted, and to this challenge he replied dryly, "That's about it, Mr. President." The statesmanship of Borden and of Botha behind the scenes eventually led the Dominion leaders to agree to veil their sovereignty under the name, at any rate, of mandate, and this Mr. Wilson was willing to accept. This discussion had been very gratifying to Monsieur Clemenceau, and for the first time he had heard the feelings of his heart expressed with unbridled candor. He beamed on Mr. Hughes, and punctuated his every sentence with unconcealable delight. "Bring your savages with you," he said to Mr. Lloyd George beforehand, and to the Australian, "Mr. Hughes, I have heard that in early life you were a cannibal." "Believe me, Mr. President," said the Commonwealth Prime Minister, "that has been greatly exaggerated." This day's meeting was an event in the proceedings of the Council of Ten. The Ten now entered the period, indispensable but undefinable, of commissions. Here were the crucial questions. Here were the real differences. But first let us know the facts. Accordingly, commissions were appointed. At one time or another 58 commissions were formed to find out all about everything, and to enable the masters of the world, if masters they remained, to decide wisely and justly and tolerably how the maps of the world should be redrawn and how its depleted riches should be apportioned. In this domain the most effective step was probably the creation as an executive department of the Supreme Council, of the Supreme Economic Council, to which was later assigned, for instance, the feeding of Austria and all such matters. Thus was averted in Vienna and elsewhere the final catastrophe of mass deaths from starvation, which was otherwise imminent. But besides this vital executive function, commissions were set up in every sphere to prepare proposals for the treaty. Commissions upon the financial arrangements, upon the economic clauses, upon reparations, upon the punishment of war criminals and hanging the Kaiser, upon all the territorial issues, the frontiers of Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, upon the future of Turkey and Arabia, upon colonies in Africa and Asia and islands in the Pacific Ocean. In all, 58 commissions, great and small, upon objects wise and foolish. Even at the cost of some anticipation of the narrative, it will be convenient to dispose of some of the less serious of these topics at this stage. We have seen to what extent Mr. Lloyd George had yielded to the newspaper and popular demand that he should use the strongest language about "make them pay," and how he had tried to do this while at the same time safeguarding himself as far as possible by ifs and buts. For instance, in effect, they shall pay to the utmost farthing, if they can do so without delaying the economic revival of the world. Or, they shall pay the maximum possible. But what is the maximum possible must be ascertained by financial experts. When the election was over and I had asked the Prime Minister how he was going to meet the expectations of the public that all the damage of the war would be paid for by Germany, he had replied, "It will all have to be settled by an inter-allied commission. We will put on this commission the ablest men we can find, men not mixed up in politics or electioneering. They will examine the whole matter coolly and scientifically, and they will report to us what is feasible. Now that the time had come, he chose Mr. Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia, Lord Cunliffe, the Governor of the Bank of England, and Lord Sumner, one of the ablest judicial authorities and greatest legal intellects at our disposal. I was to be expected that the Inter-Allied Commission, with its powerful American element, would reduce the clamour of the election and the claptrap of the popular press to hard matter-of-fact business. But the Commission on Reparations was never able to reach agreement. Lord Cunliffe's subcommittee on capacity to pay, which reported in April, cautiously avoided any figure. The governor had begun apparently to feel some misgivings. At any rate, he did not wish to be committed publicly. His subcommittee declared that the factors were too fluctuating to render a forecast possible. Enormous figures, however, still continued to rule in authoritative circles. Mr. Lamont of the American Representatives has, in a published article, stated that subject to certain important conditions, he was willing to go as high as a capital sum of 7,500 millions, that the French asked for 10,000 millions, and that the British would not accept less than 12,000. The Prime Minister was not therefore ever to receive that substantial, but at the same time reasonable figure, vouched for by the highest authority, of which he stood greatly in need. His various semi-official conversations with the British representatives gave him no comfort. They spoke always in extremely optimistic terms of German capacity to pay, and on no occasion was any lower figure mentioned than £8,000 million. Invited formally on March 6 to name a figure, on the assumption that it was to be insisted on even at the point of breaking off the peace negotiations, they promised to report separately by March 17. But of this report there is no record. The oracle was mute, and the embarrassed Prime Minister was left to bear the burden himself, with the choice either of infuriating the public by mentioning a low figure for which no authority could be cited, or a high figure which his instinct and reason alike convinced him could never be obtained. So no figure of German reparations was fixed by the Allied and associated powers. Other commissions labored upon the economic clauses of the peace, and whole chapters of the treaty were filled with provisions, mostly temporary in character, for making sure that the trade of the Allies would be restarted ahead of that of enemy countries. This separate work was never brought into relation with the financial clauses. Thus, the draft treaty imposed upon Germany at one and the same time an unspecified and unlimited liability and every conceivable impediment upon the means of payment. Mr. Keynes, a man of clairvoyant intelligence and no undue patriotic bias, was a member of the staff which Great Britain transported to Paris for the peace conference. Saturated in the Treasury knowledge of the real facts, he revolted against the absurd objectives which had been proclaimed, and still more against the execrable methods by which they were to be achieved. In a book, footnote, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, end of footnote, which gained a vast publicity, particularly in the United States, he exposed and denounced a Carthaginian peace. He showed in successive chapters of unanswerable good sense the monstrous character of the financial and economic clauses. On all these matters his opinion is good. Carried away, however, by his natural indignation at the economic terms which were to be solemnly enacted, he wrapped the whole structure of the peace treaties in one common condemnation. His qualifications to speak on the economic aspects were indisputable, but on the other and vastly more important side of the problem he could judge no better than many others. The King's view of the Peace of Versailles, justified as it was on the special aspects with which he was acquainted, greatly influenced the judgment of England and America on the whole settlement. It is, however, of high importance for those who wish to understand what actually happened that the economic and general aspects of the Treaty of Versailles should be kept entirely separate. When Mr. Lloyd George was reproached or rallied in private during the peace conference upon the economic and financial clauses, he was accustomed to make the following answer: "It is too soon to expect the peoples who have suffered so much to regain their sanity. What does it matter what is written in the treaty about German payments? If it cannot be carried out, it will fall to the ground of its own weight. We have to give satisfaction to the view of the multitude who have endured such frightful injuries. We will, however, insert in the treaty clauses which provide for the recurrent review of these provisions after a few years have passed. It is no good fretting about it now. We must let them all calm down. All I am trying to do now is to insert the machinery of revision in the text of the treaty." This may not be heroic, but it is very largely what has come to pass. The main economic clauses of the Carthaginian peace have either lapsed or have been revised under the machinery provided in the treaty. And, in fact, the Dawes Agreement claims no more from Germany than the 2,000 to 2,500 millions indemnity which the well-instructed British Treasury mentioned as a reasonable figure on the first occasion when their opinion was invited. Another commission labored upon the punishment of war criminals. Horrible things had been done in the war, and while it raged, the fighting fury of millions had been inflamed by the tale. The victors were now in a position to lay down their own view of these events. Certainly in military executions, in organized frightfulness as distinct from spontaneous and uncontrollable brutality in actual fighting, the case was black against the Germans. They had stood throughout the war on conquered soil. The Allies had with difficulty defended their own invaded lands. Germany had held for 4 years writhing populations in her grip. To British minds, the execution of Edith Cavell, and still more of Captain Fryatt, were crimes for which somebody should be held rigorously accountable. But France and Belgium had long and hideous indictments to unfold. 1,000 atrocious acts committed by privates, by sergeants, by captains, by the orders of generals, marshalled behind them a cloud of witness. There were also dark tales from the sea, not wholly one-sided, but here also was the German submarine campaign, sinking merchant ships at sight, and the Lusitania with some munitions, but also with its 40 babies, and hospital ships with their helpless, nerve-shattered patients and faithful nurses, sinking and choking in the cold sea. This found no counterpart in any of the reprisals, fierce and ferocious as some of them were, which these deeds extorted from seafaring men. The conduct of the Bulgarians in Serbia excited the extreme indignation of the investigators. As for Turkish atrocities, marching till they dropped dead the greater part of the garrison at Kut, massacring uncounted thousands of helpless Armenians, men, women and children together, whole districts blotted out in one administrative holocaust. These were beyond human redress. But a passionate demand arose in Belgium, France and England that certain definite deeds, contrary to such laws of war as men have tried to make and keep, should be brought home to individuals. No one could deny that this held justice. But how was it to be carried out? The submarine lieutenant could plead the orders of his superiors. These he had to obey upon his life. Whether hospital ships should be sunk or not was a matter for governments. A naval lieutenant could only do what he was told. The executions had behind them whatever sanctions the military tribunals of warring nations could give. As for the brutality in the zone of the armies, obscure people could be indicated who had done vile things, but they said they had not, or alternatively, that their officers had told them to do it. The officers said they had not, or would have said so if they could have been found. Or thirdly, that they could match these incidents with others done against themselves, which they had seen and in respect of which there was no lack of testimony. Commissions were appointed to probe these matters. Material was plentiful, but where lay the responsibility? The captain had ordered the platoon to fire the volley. He had received his orders from the military governor. The military governor had acted under the authority accorded him by his commission. The corps commander could say he obeyed the army group, and the army group was but the servant of main headquarters. Above all was the German government supported by the German people, and at the summit the emperor. Led on by logic, the commission climbed this ladder. How could they condemn the sergeant or the captain for actions for which the general bore responsibility? How could they condemn the general when the government and the parliament had approved or at least acquiesced? So if anyone was to be punished, it must not be the small people, but the big. Thus, after months of toilsome argumentation, a list was drawn up which included all the greatest men in Germany, all the army commanders, all the most famous generals, most of the princes, and above all the Kaiser. An article of the peace treaty obliged the Germans to stigmatize all their greatest men and potentates as war criminals. The mere inscribing of all these names upon the list was sufficient to bring the whole business to futility. The one practical measure was to hang the Kaiser, who was the all-highest and who was constitutionally responsible for everything that his armies had done. Much vitality still remained in the trial of the Kaiser. Mr. Lloyd George persisted and persevered. He was not only committed to this aim, he was ardent for it. The Americans disinterested themselves in the matter. The French, mildly scandalized, but at the same time amused, gave a gay assent. The law officers elaborated their processes. However, the Kaiser was outside Allied jurisdiction. He had been driven out of France. He had fled from Germany. He had found refuge in Holland. A demand for the extradition or surrender of the Kaiser was formally made to Holland. Mr. Lloyd George, at the height of his triumph after the signature of the Treaty of Versailles, announced to Parliament that the Kaiser was to be tried by an international tribunal in London. What followed might have been foreseen. Field Marshal von Hindenburg declared that he took full personal responsibility for all the acts done by the German armies from 1916 onwards and offered to deliver himself to judgment. All the Kaiser's sons wrote by the hand of Prince Eitel Fritz, offering themselves collectively as rams taken in the thicket. The fugitive at dawn saw before him a martyr's crown without much likelihood for the usual physical inconveniences. There can hardly have been a moment in history when martyrdom stood at so high a premium. But the Dutch are an obstinate people, and, more important still, Holland is a small country. Small countries were very much in fashion at the time of the peace conference. Gallant little Belgium was being evacuated, reparted, compensated and congratulated. The war had been fought to make sure that the smallest state should have the power to assert its lawful rights against even the greatest, and this will probably be for several generations an enduring fact. Holland came to the rescue of the Allies. She refused to surrender the Kaiser. Whether or not the subterranean intrigues of old-world secret diplomacy may have conveyed to the Dutch government some assurance that they would not be immediately fallen upon with armed violence by all the victorious nations, will never be ascertained. Mr. Lloyd George was genuinely indignant, but by this time among responsible people in England he was alone. The victorious states therefore submitted to the Dutch refusal, and the Kaiser still dwells in Holland. We have now disposed of a number of much talked-of issues, which beset the peace conference. None of them, excepting the League of Nations and the disposal of German colonies, touched essentials, and the rest dispersed themselves in a comparatively short time. Many people will be quite surprised to remember how strongly they once felt about them. The idealism of America was now definitely made its contact with the wickedness of Britain and of Europe. Absurd ideas about what the Germans should pay are being embodied in clauses which will never be put into execution, and which indeed are safeguarded by other clauses from ever being put into execution. The war criminals have found shelter under the shields of the most renowned warriors of Germany, and the Dutch will not give up the Kaiser for Lloyd George to hang. Having thus cleared the ground of many encumbrances and trivialities, we are free to approach the central problems of race and territory, of the balance of power in Europe, and of the foundations of a world state. These dominate the future, and there is no cottage or hut in which a white, brown, red, black, or yellow family is now dwelling which may not some day find itself directly and quite unpleasantly affected by them. Meanwhile, temper was rising in all the countries. The British public demanded to know when peace was going to be signed and how soon Germany would be made to pay, and what had happened about the Kaiser. The Republican Party in America spoke in scornful terms of the President's scheme for world improvement, and stridently called for the return of the American troops and the collection of the American debts. The Italians clamored for a settlement of their territorial and colonial requirements, and France was boiling with rage and anxiety about her future security. Behind all, the defeated nations waited paralyzed with anxiety and incertitude to learn their fate. It had been hoped that the acceptance by the British dominions of the mandatory principle and the agreement reached with President Wilson on the issue would clear the way for practical decisions about frontiers and jurisdictions. But he remained determined that the drawing up and adoption of the Covenant of the League of Nations should precede all territorial settlements. The Council of Ten was spurred to action by the fierce and growing impatience of the countries they represented, and in the earliest days of February there occurred the first crisis of the peace conference. Mr. Lloyd George, voicing the opinion of all, demanded that practical issues should no longer be shelved. How was it possible to frame this new world instrument while everyone was waiting for the answers to urgent questions? Any man's task lay before them. It was their duty to make peace. They had gathered together for that. They would fail in their duty if they did not give it speedily to the world. It was known that the President had to return to the United States on February 14 in order to discharge certain imperative constitutional duties. How was it possible to decide the Covenant of the League before then? The President, however, declared to an audience at once incredulous and relieved that all should be settled by that date. This was in fact accomplished. The Commission was driven forward at breakneck speed, and by an extraordinary effort, in which the British delegation staff played a decisive part, the draft Covenant of the League was actually finished and presented in full conference on February 14. 3 months had now passed since the firing stopped, and so far no agreement had been reached on any one of the definite and all-important issues upon which the immediate peace and recovery of Europe depended. In many regions, the power of the victors to enforce their decisions had obviously diminished. A heavy price in blood and privations was in the end to be paid by helpless and distracted peoples for the long delay. But here at last was a majestic constitution to which all the Allied states had given provisional but earnest assent. Many minds had made their contribution to the covenant of the League. Phillimore, Robert Cecil, Smuts, and Hearst are names which forever link the British Empire with its institution. Some errors and imperfections arose inevitably from the haste and pressure under which the covenant was prepared. Nevertheless, the base of the new building was set upon the living rock, and the mighty foundation stone, shaped by the innumerable chiselings of merciful men the world over and swung into position by loyal and dexterous English pulleys, will bear for all time the legend, "Well and truly laid by Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America." Who can doubt that upon and around this granite block will ultimately be built a dwelling place and palace to which all the men and all the lands will sooner or later resort in sure trust?